Okay, so I thought I'd have a quick look at what governs who a Prime Minister appoints to his cabinet. Well, it's not as easy as you might think. It's got a number of factors to consider. One of them is that he's got to appease all the different factions within his political party and also the big beasts that might be roaming around his political party as well. So, a Prime Minister always tries to get some balance of the different factions within the political party he's from. So, for example, you think about David Cameron, amongst his Conservative ministers, he's got in there some ministers who are fairly European friendly, Europhiles, people like Kenneth Clarke. He was the Justice Secretary, he's now the Minister without portfolio. He's also got in there some more right-wing Conservatives who are much more hostile to the idea of the European Union and fit more into the Thatcherite mould. People like, for example, Michael Gove. You also had in there earlier on people like Dr. Liam Fox as well, who had to go for one reason or another earlier on in the government. If you think about previous governments as well, Tony Blair had people from his wing of the party, people like Peter Mandelson, David Blunkett, but he also had some left-wing or more left-wing politicians, more old Labour politicians in his government as well. People like Claire Short, International Secretary, Michael Meacher as well in his first term, who was the Environmental Minister. Think about Gordon Brown, okay, he had a mixture of Blairites, people like James Pennell, Hazel Blears, and also his loyal supporters like Ed Balls. Within all this, he's also got to consider the big beast within his political party as well, people like the unsackables. So Tony Blair had to have Gordon Brown in his cabinet. Basically, as time went on, he was basically unsackable. Gordon Brown as well had Lord Peter Mandelson in his government. Again, he was a big beast within the Labour Party, and as well he actually essentially became Deputy Prime Minister. So he's got to appease the factions and also the big political players within his political party. Another factor which Prime Ministers have considered are things like loyalty, rewarding MPs and ministers who have supported perhaps their ideas or supported their campaign to become Prime Minister in the first place. David Cameron, for example, has rewarded George Osborne and Michael Gove. They're two MPs who were fairly close to his political ideas and helped him become leader of the Conservative Party. George Osborne, of course, is Chancellor, Michael Gove, Education Secretary. Think about the Brown government, okay, his loyal supporters were people like Ed Balls, who he made Education Secretary. Tony Blair previously also had loyal Blairites who supported his agenda, people like David Blunkett, Dr. John Reid. So rewarding loyalty is important as well. Thirdly, sometimes a Prime Minister might find that experience is quite important as well, especially if a party's been out of government for a while. So under David Cameron, Kenneth Clarke, who we mentioned earlier, he became Minister for Justice. He was later on demoted to be Minister without portfolio. But he's got a long history of being involved in government. I mean, he was the Chancellor of the Exchequer under John Major. Again, the second most important job in the government. Under Mrs Thatcher, he was Health Secretary and Education Secretary as well. So his ministerial career and knowledge and experience goes back to the mid-1980s, if not a bit earlier. So again, experience can be important sometimes. Another factor they've got to consider, especially this is just for David Cameron at the moment, is their coalition partners. As I'm sure you're already aware, is that under the coalition and the coalition agreement, Nick Clegg is very much involved in the appointment of Liberal Democrat ministers, and it was stated in the coalition agreement as to which ministerial positions will be reserved for Liberal Democrats. So David Cameron clearly is limited and has to consider the Liberal Democrat elements of his government. And when a Liberal Democrat minister is replaced, he's got to be replaced by a fellow Liberal Democrat. Okay, so David Laws, for example, who was the first Secretary of the Treasury, Liberal Democrat, he was replaced when he fell from power by Danny Alexander. And finally, another factor they often consider are things like the cabinet reflecting the nation. This is particularly so with gender and also with age as well to some extent. So Prime Ministers try and get a gender mix and sometimes a racial or ethnic mix as well in the cabinet, so it appears to be reflecting the country more. So David Cameron has been criticised for having very few women in his cabinet. Theresa May, the Home Secretary, is probably the most prominent woman in the cabinet. Of course, there's one less woman in the cabinet now following the demise, if that's the right word, of Maria Miller from the Culture Secretary. However, it was interesting that David Cameron appointed Shadi Javid as the new Culture Secretary. Not only because he's the first Muslim to be in the cabinet, but also because of his age as well. He's quite a young Member of Parliament, and very often Prime Ministers like to promote what they see as new talent. It gives new MPs who've been elected in the previous election on the backbenches. It gives them, if you like, the hope that one day they might make that position as well. So I would say Shadi Javid is one of these characters who is seen as being a new talent, the future of the party, if you like, giving them a chance to be involved in the government. You saw it under Gordon Brown as well when he promoted James Pennell to Secretary of State for Social Security. He too was seen as being a young, if you like, mover and shaker in the party at that time. So Prime Ministers, when choosing the cabinet, it is one of their prerogative powers to appoint and dismiss who they like. On paper it makes them seem very powerful, but in practice I would say they are limited by all the different factors and ideas which they've got to try and, kind of, not consolidate, but try and make a reality. So choosing the cabinet is not easy for a Prime Minister, and of course if they make mistakes then they can be punished as well.